Welcome to the Fusionary Health Podcast. I have a special guest for you today. Dr. Leslie Carr is a psychologist and an expert in how trauma, stress, culture, and digital technology impact the mind. She's been active in mental health advocacy and public psychoeducation for almost 15 years, and her work in this space has been featured in the LA Times, ABC News, and Ask Dr. Drew, amongst other places. She's the host of an e-course on how to use technology mindfully, which can be found on her website at lesliecarr.com. And she has a podcast called The Nature of Nurture, which explores how people respond to their environments in complicated ways. The Nature of Nurture is available on all podcasts and on YouTube. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much for having me, Shivani. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, when we spoke in our pre-interview call, we had the best time.
It
And
was a really good time.
I
Yeah.
was like, I rarely get to talk to someone who's just this knowledgeable and this, like when you just have one of those intellectual conversations that really feeds you, and that's what we got to have. So I'm planning for that to be what we get to do for our audience today.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I felt the exact same way. So let's dive right in.
Awesome. So let's talk first about mental health and your perspective on how trauma, stress, culture, and digital technology impact the mind. Because I think a lot of times as humans, people are like, oh, I have this mind and we're going through
Yeah,
life and it's all
yeah.
good and life happens to you.
hmm
And maybe there's a different perspective and awareness we can bring around the things that impact us and how we can then approach it.
Yeah, if I were to start really broadly, the reason why I sort of explain that I do that way is because I'm really passionate just about the idea that we are so much more as human beings than our genes and biochemistry. And I think a lot of people are given the impression that, whatever brain you have that you're born with is just the one that you're stuck with. And so if you're struggling in some way, it's an indication that you're broken in some way, shape, or form. And that can be anything, right? It can be depression, anxiety, all of that stuff. I think a lot of people feel like the best that they can ever do is sort of make do with it.
True.
And with all of my knowledge and skill that I've amassed in the time that I've been in practice and going back to all of my years of studying, I really strongly believe that the human mind, not just our brains, but our minds are far more complicated than that. And we are, as humans, really responding to all of the life experiences that we have, positive, negative, and anything in between. If I were to get scientific about it for a moment, I could talk about something like neuroplasticity,
True.
which is to say that in the first 3 to 4 years of life, growing brains are absorbing pretty much everything from the world around them. As we are learning to speak and walk and all of that stuff, we're learning how we can expect other people to relate to us, how we sort of
Sure.
fit into the world. We're absorbing cultural messages and all of this stuff. And our brains become increasingly less plastic, as we say, as time goes by. They never become non-plastic. We are, as human beings, always growing, learning, changing, adapting, maladapting, and adapting, all of that stuff. It happens throughout the
Sure.
entire lifespan. But we have impressionable experiences when we're children, and then we spend the rest of our lives sort of living on top of those early formative experiences. And I think the thing that I always just want to start with whenever I'm speaking about this stuff is helping people to understand themselves in the context of their own lives. And at this point, that means our cultural experiences, our family experiences. And these days, it also includes our digital experiences because it's become such a huge part of our lives, that piece.
True. And it's so interesting when you say that. I think about so many of us as mothers and fathers who do so much work to mitigate trauma because we
Yeah.
know that, like, I think of it as, can I give my children the most idyllic, beautiful life in the
Mhm.
hopes that they'll have nothing to go to therapy for later?
Yes.
And it's
Yeah.
funny because I think that that's actually impossible because
I agree.
you can't
Mhm.
control for every factor. But so many of us try so hard. And then I see the opposite effect happen where we've
Mhm.
actually entitled might be a strong word for it, but we've like, in my opinion, entitled them. Like we took care of every need and every want. And then all of a sudden they hit their teens and you're like, okay, I'm expecting you to function independently. And they look at you like, That's
Yeah,
not
but I
going to
haven't been
happen.
taught how to, right? Yeah.
No.
Where our brains are in the exact same place at the same time. I'm remembering how amazing that phone call was. No,
Yeah.
but I went to the exact same place that you went to, which is to say that not only do I think that it is impossible to fully insulate our children from traumatic experiences, I actually think that we don't want to. That it is part of the nature of the human condition that we will experience trauma. And part of what we actually ultimately want is not necessarily a life that's free of trauma, but resilience.
Right.
I mean, if I were to really nerd out for a moment, there's a really cool Radio Lab episode about this for, the podcast crowd that is listening to us. But the very experience of being born and taking our first breath is quite literally a traumatic experience. We can't,
True.
it doesn't appear to be what we're here for, to have trauma-free lives.
True. True. But it's interesting because it obviously multiple thoughts can coexist. But if you watch the majority of people here in America, majority, when you're trying to raise your kids, you're trying to mitigate for all factors. Like nowadays, the helicopter mom is organic
Yeah.
food and BPA free, and like really a lot of pressure around that perfection. Putting everything aside, we're putting them into the best schools we can, and then we're pushing them. So how do you create stress and resilience when you're constantly trying to mitigate it?
It's a really good question. I mean, I don't think that there's any harm in trying to at least mitigate it, lessen it. It's not like we don't want deliberately to traumatize our children or anything like
Right.
that. But I think that you're onto something when you talk about sort of the ways in which, the word entitlement is tricky. It's just
Yeah.
loaded.
Yeah.
But helicopter parenting is a real thing.
Totally.
And I think that when people try to overfunction for their children so that their kids won't face stress, we're not actually doing our kids any favors.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that culture shift happening. Maybe it's because we're all skewing with kids a little bit older now, so we're looking at it differently. And there's so many great books like How to Raise an Adult. Like there's books that are saying, hey, if we're not
Mm-hmm.
going to raise them to be adults, why are we expecting them to be productive, functioning adults? But in the trend I see is like let them have the failures young. Let them do the homework themselves and get that grade, the science project themselves, and
Exactly.
let them get the grades where they fall. And I find that takes a
Yeah.
lot of discipline. It's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And I think there's some really important stuff in here because I'm thinking about the way that a parent's anxiety can end up ultimately negatively impacting their children. I read an article recently on slate.com that was really disturbing. This gets us a little bit more into the sort of digital universe, but I think it's a really good example for what we're talking about right now, where teachers have been complaining that they're having a really hard time getting kids in their classrooms, let's say teenage kids, but I would say anything kind of middle school and above,
Sure.
having a really hard time getting the kids in their classrooms to stay off of their phones
Yeah.
because the kids have been trained to never miss a message from their parents. And the parents will complain if they text their kids and don't get a response. And I know that this is a very loaded thing because I think
Yeah.
these days there are a lot of reasons why parents are nervous when their kids are at school. And I don't want to say anything that's overly triggering, but I think we all know what I'm talking about right now.
Yeah.
Parents and adults have to be monitoring and working with their own anxiety. Because if your kid can't be off their phone while they're in school and focused on learning, because
Right.
you're so anxious about what would happen if you texted them and they didn't respond, everything is turned upside down and backwards.
True.
It's so I think people put a lot on their children without even realizing what they're doing.
It's a fascinating thought. That's even a profound thought right there because it's almost like, and I do this with my team, right? If my team needs to know something, I make a quick decision like, oh, I'll text them. And then I'm like, well, there's text, there's WhatsApp, there's email, and there's Asana. What level of urgency is this that everything is a text? It's not a text. Could it be an email and someone responds in their own good time? So I wonder if we can just create that habit shift with our own children. Like, when I'm emailing my kids, I'm emailing them in school, and then I'm assuming that after their day is over, they have a break, they'll respond. But everything doesn't have to be a text because you're right, we're probably triggering them and they're behaving like we do, which is every text is a respond needing to be responded to.
100%. And we are sort of squarely in the wheelhouse of kind of coming full circle to how we started, which is to say that so many people, particularly in the United States these days, are walking around feeling very anxious, very frazzled, unaware of how their lifestyle and life decisions are factoring into their anxiety and their overall lack of a feeling of well-being. And think about how much like what you just said is so vital to the way that so many people live, which is to say that we live in a world where things have been made to seem really urgent, even when they absolutely are not.
Yeah, true.
You
Very
know,
true.
30 years ago, people got through the school day without texting their parents or texting their kids. And, you know, with rare exception, because obviously bad things do happen sometimes, everybody made it home at the end of the day. You know,
True.
it's like it's very few things are actually urgent. But when you live in a world where you're made to feel like everything is urgent all the time, the end result of that is anxiety, stress, constantly feeling unsettled because everything, how do you even put out all the fires that are happening all at the same time? I mean, our phones have become, you know,
It's
bouquets
true.
of stress for us.
It's true. And you know what? It's funny because I oftentimes come out of a podcast interview, either I'm interviewing someone or most of the time, most of my days, I'm interviewed. And so as I'm sitting and I'm teaching and I'm giving so much input and energy into the camera, into what I'm trying to share with the audience, right afterwards, I check my phone. And sometimes my gaps are only 5 minutes because I'm booked on the hours. And in that 5 minutes, the level of stress that's caused in my life by the number of texts is insane. It's like you're about to triage people, business, family, kids. I literally feel like I'm in the middle of a intersection and I have to figure out how to not get hit. And it's a lot of stress. And I think to myself every time, like, maybe don't touch your phone. Maybe family first, and all business can be done at the end of the day or tomorrow. But it's
Yeah.
hard. That's actually discipline to say tech, like, first of all, don't get stressed out about it. And second of all, maybe this new discipline of if texts are causing you that much stress, maybe pay attention to what you're texting out and is it actually urgent? Because I fired off a text this morning to my kids because I remembered, I was like, oh, I want them to have Fitbits for that trip this summer. So I texted them, hey, pick a Fitbit. But I texted it. Was it urgent? No. It's just my thought in my brain was, let me get this out fast. So I wonder if the biggest shift we can create is how do we communicate with each other as humanity to not stress each other out?
Yes, yes. And how do you determine the difference between what is important or urgent and something that truly is not? And how do you sort of organize yourself accordingly? You
Yeah,
know, ask them about the Fitbit over dinner or whatever needs to happen just to make sure that it's not. But I think it's an excellent example. And
yeah,
I'm so with you. I mean, there's so much in here just because it's affecting everybody so much these days. So
right.
much.
And it's almost like I think we don't give the brain a break. Is that's my
Yeah.
new thought is if every minute you're free, you're in social and you consider social relaxing, which I
Yeah.
do. I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna get on social media. I'm just gonna watch some videos. The problem is there's an algorithm there, and that algorithm is feeding you stuff. So sometimes
Yeah.
I'll sit down and I'll realize I'm watching videos about kids getting kidnapped and all sorts of like it's always scary stuff because that's what's gonna hold my
Mhm.
attention the fastest. And then I'm
Mhm.
like, wait, why are you watching negativity? You choose not
Yeah.
to consume anything negative. I would never put a TV show on that was
Mhm.
scary or violent. So why would I let my phone feed that up to me? And then all throughout the day, I'm consuming garbage, negativity, fear, just thought forms that don't belong in my energy, in my being, in my brain, in any of it, and are
Mhm.
probably causing a chemical reaction of
Yeah.
stress and fear. So will
Yeah.
you speak into like the state of mental health due to social media and its algorithms and how we need to consciously unhook ourselves?
Yeah, I have two major thoughts in response to what you just shared and said. So, on the one hand, I do think it's extremely important to think about our media diets in terms of what our inputs are, right? Because our minds are very complex things, and our mindsets are largely determined by what gets kind of put into it, right? I mean, it's the difference between Doritos and roasted chickpeas, right? It's like, you can either eat something healthy or you can eat trash.
Yeah,
And the way that we feel often is a result of mentally what we're putting in.
true.
I also think about it through the lens of brainwave states, because I think something that's really cool to think about is what is happening to your brain when you're plugged into social media or you're texting a lot. We're most often in that mode in a beta brainwave state, which is just to say moving pretty quickly, oftentimes mentally kind of firing on all cylinders, which is not conducive to creativity or, spontaneous, pleasant thought formation. And if you think about it, a lot of people know what it's like to feel like they have their best thoughts or they do their best thinking in the shower.
Yes.
And there's a reason why, right? Which is because we're relaxed. And so when we are in a relaxed state of mind and we're open to receiving because our brain isn't getting clogged with a bunch of stuff coming into it,
Right.
we can have spontaneous creative ideas. And I think that's true both, when we're in the shower, it's also true when we're in nature,
Right.
and even more specifically, just not on technology. And it's not
True.
to say that it's all bad, it's these things are part of our lives now, and I use this stuff just as much as anybody else does. But being mindful about unplugging and at least making the effort to be not on your phone is super useful. I do something that I know is probably not pretty common, which is just to say that I will leave my house without my phone and take a walk, go to yoga, do whatever, and just, everything will still be there when I get back. I don't have to take my phone with me. And I think we have culturally lost the value of that,
Yeah.
even though it's actually super important. For any
True.
one individual person, it's so important.
True. I mean, it's interesting. That sounds really foreign. Like, how could you? How could you leave your phone at home? What if you had a car accident? What if anything happened? But one thing that irks me is when you leave yoga and the first thing you do is check your phone.
Yeah.
I always think of it as, wow, you just unhooked, you tuned in, you silenced, you connected, and then now you're going to pick up your phone and just rip that cord of you being so in your best self that fast. Like, we undo it in 2 seconds. Like, why can't we stay in that space just a little longer?
Amen. And I will say that it's personally a pet peeve that I wrestle with in my own mind, just at my local yoga studio, sometimes seeing people do that before they are even off their mats. Like their
Yeah.
phone is sitting next to their mat. So like the second they're out of Shavasana, for those who do yoga and know what
Yeah.
we're talking about, the second Shavasana is over, they are checking their phones. And
Right.
I have to do a little inner work because it bums me out,
Yeah.
So it's like, all right, stay in your own lane, stay in your own peace, go walk home. But to
Yeah.
what you said before, generally speaking, I have a rule, which is that I will leave my phone at home if I'm doing something that's within walking distance and take my phone with me if I'm getting behind the wheel of a car,
Sure.
just in case something happened. And
Yeah.
but even as I say that, I recognize that, prior to well, 2007 is when the iPhone came out. Obviously, before that, we had, sort of rudimentary text messaging. But,
Yeah.
I happen to be 46 years old. So I just remember a day when, if you got into a car accident, you figured it out and you
Yeah.
didn't have a cell phone. Like we all
True.
survived, you
It's
know?
true. No, it's very
Mhm.
true. It didn't have to be that way. And it's also interesting the idea of, when do we allow the brain to take a break? And what is the importance of it? You mentioned beta waves. When I'm in the shower, I do get my best ideas. And
Mhm.
it's one of those funny things where I always think to myself, I should just shower 3 times a day. I just produce the best content, and I'd literally change the whole world if I just showered, because my thoughts are profound. I'm always like, I need to write these down. The best quotes, the best insights from Ayurveda. I'm like, dang, my creativity really flows in when I'm in the shower. And it's like, well, why can't we allow space for that in our day? Why is it that we're so,
Yeah.
it has to be a music, it has to be podcast, it has to be YouTube, it has to be Facebook or Instagram? Like, why are we just constantly so checked out of life, and then we're not leaving space for our brain to even be creative. And so, what are the other detriments to our brain and our mental health from being so overconnected?
That's such a good question. I mean, first of all, I just want to say that I love that as an intervention strategy. It's like if you really want to get off your phone and have your best creative ideas, just shower 3 times a day. But I think that it's hinting at something really important, which is just what happens when we log off. And the good news is that we can do it other ways. We can sit down, we can have a cup of tea, we can not look at our phone while we're sitting there and having a cup of tea. We can go take a walk, we can take a walk in the woods, all of that stuff. But, ideally, like alerts off, phone away. But where the dots that are getting connected in my mind to answer your question is I'm thinking about the fundamental value of boredom
Yeah.
and being able to handle certain things that are frustrating. So, if I were to think about some of the more dramatic examples of what we're talking about right now, maybe the more distressing examples, when we look at really young kids today, Generation Alpha, the sort of today's 13-year-olds
Mm.
that basically have never really known life without smartphone technology and iPads and
iPad.
that kind of stuff. What we see a lot in that generation is kids that are having a really hard time with things like boredom and frustration tolerance.
Mm.
There is an expectation on a certain level, and understandably so, because they've been living this way their whole lives, that they will never have to deal with uncomfortable or difficult feelings. Because so often when they were kids, anytime that they were having a hard time, like an iPad was stuck in their face.
Right.
And I think that part of what that really hints at or teaches us is that there is something valuable for the human brain in terms of being able to handle difficult experiences on our own. And I always want to liken it to it's almost like building a muscle.
Hmm.
Like it would not be very healthy for the physical body to never move, to never lift a weight, to never exercise itself in any capacity. And we do have a lot of, there can be challenging physical structural issues that come up if you're never moving your body or getting exercise.
Of course.
And I think that we can use that as a metaphor for what happens in the mind
Mm.
when we are never bored, when we never have to handle frustration. Think about instances of waiting in line at the post office. There are just certain things we have to do in life that are inherently boring if we don't distract ourselves or numb ourselves out.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, much like we do our best thinking in the shower, we actually could be doing our best thinking in line at the post office if we just would put our phones away and
Right.
let ourselves be bored.
Yeah.
Doesn't even take that long, 5 minutes of just sheer boredom, staring at the backpack on the person in front of us. It's sort of all it takes.
Wow. And we never do that.
So many people never do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. When you were speaking, I was thinking about how in Ayurveda, which is a system of medicine I teach, we teach so much about body, mind, and spirit and bringing them
Yeah.
into alignment. And so in the health and wellness world, we talk so much about inflammation, lymphatic system, vagus nerve toning, gut health, microbiome, all the topics that we get into. And
Hmm.
a lot of the goal from the Ayurvedic perspective is let's bring the body into alignment of its health so that the mind is at peace. If gut health is good, mind is healthier. It's brain gut connection, gut brain axis, as we say it now. But truly in Ayurveda, that goal was peace in the body, so we have peace in the mind, peace in our emotions, and thus we have that alignment. And when you have that alignment, you're so clear. You can figure out your dharma, your purpose here on earth, and live that out with such clarity and such joy. And you have this vibrant health. And so I remember when we spoke, we talked about the mind. And in the Vedic philosophies, like the Buddhist philosophies, we talk about the mind as this monkey mind that has all these thoughts. It's like a river flowing with thoughts. And how there's an intellect, there's a you, there's an intuition that's looking over the thoughts. You have the ability to see your thoughts and train yourself to see your thoughts. It's
Yeah.
hard because we get so wrapped up in the thoughts and we think the thoughts are us. So, will you speak into How is it that we can learn to control the mind, to not yank us around on a leash, and instead we are creating the space for better mental health overall, if not
Mhm.
some level of mind control of ourselves so that we can collect that peace?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I just appreciate everything that you're saying, the dots that are connecting here, because part of how I think about it is I think about the nature of meditation and mindfulness. And what I often, as I'm teaching, counseling, whatever role that I'm in when this kind of stuff comes up, what I often think to myself is that, not everybody is necessarily going to meditate. Not everybody wants to.
Sure.
But I think it's really important for people to know why anyone bothers to do that. And just even learning intellectually almost why anybody would bother to do that can be really clarifying.
Hmm.
Because when we meditate, and I've been a long time meditation practitioner, when we meditate, we're able to engage that witnessing presence that you're talking about, where we can see our thoughts and we can begin to not identify with them, right? We can start to sort of witness the way the mind works. And this feeling that we were talking about before, where so often everything feels urgent, right? When you meditate, and especially if you practice it and you do it with any degree of consistency, you start to develop that mental muscle that is what in Western psychology we often refer to as the witnessing presence.
Hmm.
Even if you never actually meditate, can a person just start to notice that layer? Because the only way you're not going to be able to do it while you're multitasking on your phone. It's virtually impossible to do that. I think you actually really have to have a quite advanced meditation practice to be multitasking at the level of having an incoming stream of data coming at you while you're at your phone, on your phone, and also engaging the part of you that's witnessing the experience at the same time. So for anybody who is not an experienced meditation practitioner, can you just, as miserable as this might sound, drive sometimes in the car without any music or a podcast playing?
Correct.
Can you just drive from point A to point B? Let's say it's a 10-minute drive. We don't have to do anything sort of too fit to, we don't have to make the goal too
An
high right
hour.
now. Exactly. You don't have to do it for an hour. But can you do the 10-minute drive that you normally take to pick your kids up at school without any sound playing and just be present to the experience of being in the car and driving it down the road?
Yeah.
For
And
a
I think
lot of
that's
people, that's like a revolutionary thing to suggest, but it's so
exactly.
powerful. It's really powerful.
It is, and I do it all the time because I call it collecting peace. Like we have the Ayurvedic daily self-care rituals, and I added two. Mine are collect peace and tea time is me time. Because as someone whose mind goes so fast, I literally think so much faster than I can write, than I can speak. We notice that because I'm writing a book right now, and she's like, "Wow, you do think way faster than you write." But if you can take those times and just have radio silence, it allows you to just be with your thoughts and observe them. And you know where I think you can do it most easily is body image. If you
Mm,
think about it with body image, there's a voice and it'll give you an answer in the morning. I look at my body in the morning and I'm like, wow, you've got work to do. Or I'm like, dude, you're freaking amazing. Good job. Everything's working. But that's a voice and you can observe it.
yeah.
To me, it's an easy place because I learned about body dysmorphia in therapy in college. And once I learned body dysmorphia and the notion that when you look in the mirror, you might not be seeing the truth, you're seeing a different, and I'm sure you can explain body dysmorphia better. But once I understood that, I was like, wow, we can see non-truth. Okay, then we have a very unique opportunity to retrain the mind to see truth.
So interesting because, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, but I would imagine that for a lot of women in American culture, that actually might be a really hard place to start. I think you might be underestimating how advanced you are, that you can, because I think for a lot of people, that issue is so loaded. I
Hmm.
mean, I think you're
True.
inviting people to do something that's
Yeah.
very important. I hope that particularly every woman,
Yeah.
men too, and everybody,
Men too.
everybody. But
Yeah,
you know, our relationship with our bodies is so particularly loaded
sure.
when we are female
Yeah.
that I think you're inviting people to do something that's super profound. And also, I just want to acknowledge that for a lot of people, it could be really hard
Will
because
you,
it's so triggering.
yeah, will you explain body dysmorphia? Let's just get into it.
Yeah, I guess, I would define it. I think you did a perfectly good job, but I just would say that our feelings about our bodies can be quite different than how our bodies actually look per se. So, it's sort of the equivalent of the person who looks in the mirror and thinks of themselves as fat or perceives themselves as fat. And meanwhile, they can be oftentimes not overweight at all, but their experience and relationship with their own body is not really an accurate reflection of reality.
Correct. And so maybe it is a hard one. Maybe understanding that we have a lot of voices and thoughts around our body that are just simply not true. And
Hmm.
drilling down into what is actually true is a practice that I've had for about 20 years where I'll look in the mirror and then I just look in the mirror again. I'm like, okay, wow.
I love
You're
it.
so lucky that that's your body and that's your hair. That's usually my second look, usually not the first look. The first look is the critical look. So I've just retrained myself, always look again and you'll love what you see. And isn't that great? And you should be grateful. You're alive, you're healthy, you get to do what you want to do in life. Like, what is there to complain about?
Hell
So,
yeah.
where would you recommend that people build that practice?
I actually think that a slightly easier place to do it. I mean, I hope that people will listen to you and take a page out of your playbook and experiment with what you're suggesting. But I think that a place that might be a little bit easier to access and very functional, like a very, how do I say this? Really good place to start would be with in their relationship with their phones, starting to really ask themselves what is truly urgent and what is not urgent. Do they
Hmm,
need to respond to something urgently?
can it wait?
Um, yeah, or can it wait?
That's
And
genius. That's
and like
simple, but so effective.
that might be a sort of more concrete place for people to start, but it could be game changing if people were to lean into it.
Absolutely. Because that experience did happen to me. I texted someone, I had a question, and they've texted me 3 times to try to schedule. And I finally said, I'm in interviews until 6. I might get back to you Monday. Like, I can't respond to this. This is
Yeah.
not my fire. I'm not in a firehouse right now or a fire station. I know you are on this thought, but let's create some space here. And so I wonder if that's
Yes.
boundaries and guardrails, but also acknowledging what is urgent and what is not.
100%. I mean, I love those boundaries and the idea of those boundaries. And also I think sometimes it's work that we have to do with another person. It's something we have to communicate deliberately. And sometimes it's just the inner work of I'm not going to respond to this right now. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think both things are equally good. They're going to depend on the circumstances. Sometimes we have to say to another person,
Yeah.
um, I'm not going to be able to get back to you right away. And sometimes it's like, I'll get to it later.
Absolutely. I have a question. Why do you think we have such a large scale mental health epidemic in the West and then also globally? Like,
Mm.
why is it that it feels like things are colliding and people don't have like the resilience or the support? There's so much anxiety, so much depression. Like, why is it? And then do you see a way out?
Mm. Both excellent questions. To answer the first part about what I think is going on here, I think that it is complex, but when push comes to shove, it comes down to one fundamental issue,
Hmm,
which is that human beings are hyper wired for social relatedness. And our modern world, particularly in the West, and even more so, particularly in the United States, I don't want to speak too globally right now because it's really interesting to go culture by culture.
sure.
We have a lot of data around this stuff, but in the West, our relational lives are really fractured. A lot of people are really isolated.
Hmm,
There is, what has been determined by America's Surgeon General to be an epidemic of loneliness in the
yeah.
United States, if we
Yeah,
were to
and he's
talk
Indian.
specifically. Yeah, so fantastic. I mean, I just
Yeah,
think the
I know
the
his
way
family.
that Oh, that's so wonderful. The
Yeah.
way he speaks on this issue, I think, is so valuable. I think it's so important that he said what he said and is saying what he is saying. Um, but I think that when we look at rampant mental health challenges, we have to look at it across multiple dimensions, almost all having to do with the quality of our relationships,
Hmm.
because it starts when we're young. It's our framework for who we are in the world, how we can relate to other people, all of that stuff begins when we're children. Some people have a better experience of being in families than others. People have are
Sure.
born into more and less healthy situations. And then, regardless of what happens when we're young, we have to deal with what happens once we grow up. And in the United States in particular, but in many, many parts of the world, what I see when I look out at humanity and I look out at all of the data is people that are continuing to have a really hard time in their relationships as adults. And a lot of that has to do with how much of our relationships are mediated by technology. So I don't want to sound like, a one trick pony, like all I have to talk about is our iPhones, because it's really not
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But we are, I think COVID provided sadly, a very good lesson
Yeah.
in some very important truisms of human psychology and human behavior. Because when everybody was driven into their homes and isolated to varying degrees, whether it was isolated with their families or in many, many instances, truly isolated people living by themselves and that kind of stuff, technology became a really big part of how we started to relate to one another.
True.
And the end result of all of it was disastrous. I mean, it's the mental health has been in a sort of an epidemic state of decline for the past couple of years. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence that it has to do with how isolated people have been, in part because of COVID and things like that. And also because of how much our relationships have been mediated by technology, because it works sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that I can be here having this conversation with you on Zoom.
Yeah.
But especially if we think about things like texting and trying to sort of, manage our relationships by texting,
True.
it is not a fair proxy for what it's like to, I don't know if I'm using that word right, but it's not a good alternative for actual in-person connections that involve things like physical touch. Oxytocin is released in the brain when we give someone a hug that is welcome. And, if we want to have that experience, it is pleasurable for the brain, releases a lot of happy chemicals, and is really insulating against all sorts of mental health stressors. So I think that we have to look at things across multiple dimensions.
Sure.
What happens to children when they're young, and then also just what is happening to all of us in a world where we text so much more often than we get hugs these days.
True. And you've made me think of so many things there. One, I wonder if the byproduct of introverted parents who don't have big social circles and are overworking. I'm an introvert, and my husband and I are both super into our businesses and our work, and we hate going to parties and social
Mm.
engagements. I wonder if you're doing a disservice to your children because what you're modeling is you don't have to be that social. And it's funny because I can see patterns in my kids, and I'm like, you need more play dates. You need a social life. Go make better friends. But
Mm.
it's almost like you're saying something that you're not really doing. We both have very close friends, but I can see how since pandemic, we all as a friend group used to see each other a lot more. And
Mm.
now we see each other once a month, once every 3 weeks, and we're fine with it. But I wonder if the isolationist type behavior we developed in pandemic translates to that being true in our kids, but it being 10 times worse for them.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the kid. If you have introverted kids, because it's not to make introversion wrong, but I think it has more to do with the quality of our relationships.
Yeah.
If you have kids that are introverted too, they might not necessarily want to go to parties per se. But one of the reasons why I bring up early childhood experiences when we're talking about kind of mental health writ large is because I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of people are raised in really dysfunctional environments,
Sure.
raised by people that maybe didn't want to have them, weren't prepared to be parents. It's a really hard thing to think about, but you know, child abuse is a real thing. There are a lot of people who are living with the adult traumas. They're living with their childhood traumas in their adult selves.
Wow.
And so that's a very sadly very real part of the world that we live in, is a lot of people are walking around pretty shell shocked from the experiences that they had when they were children.
Yeah, I mean, I see that sometimes when I speak at conferences on sleep, because sometimes
Mhm.
when someone's having a sleep problem, I can tell and I can ask just a question or two, and you realize the sleep has nothing to do with the basics that we teach about your diet, your this, your that, your sleep time. And if you just cut through the chase, the question is, what were the sleep habits in your home as a child? And did you feel safe?
Exactly.
And boom, the person breaks down, and you're like, oh my gosh,
Did
I
you
am
feel
not.
safe? That's the $1 million question, right? And I think sadly a lot of people have grown up in situations that for many reasons they didn't feel safe. And it's not always, big trauma with a capital T, as if they got hit or something. Obviously, that happens sometimes. Sometimes it's just, did your parents make you feel loved? Did they make you feel seen?
Yeah,
How do you as an adult feel about yourself on the basis of how people spoke to you when you were really young and really impressionable?
right,
And at the level of one's nervous system, it all comes back to safety.
right.
So I think a lot of people are just, wandering around in nervous systems that don't feel safe.
Right. So, how can we build safety for our nervous systems and those of our children?
It's such a good question. It's a really big one. There are a lot of somatic therapies that address this, but I always really want to be mindful whenever I'm speaking. I know not everybody's necessarily going to go to therapy. Maybe not everybody can afford to go to therapy. Um, I think a lot of it is making conscious choices as much as you possibly can to first of all do things to soothe your nervous system as much as humanly possible. And that might be something as simple as like regularly taking baths, or you know what I mean, like just developing some rituals around putting your phone down and drinking some tea, and giving yourself a little bit of a massage, touching your own shoulders, giving yourself a hug or something. But a lot of it has to do with making choices around whose nervous systems are you putting yourself into contact with. So,
Mm,
you know, in your life, what relationships feel good to you and
yeah.
what don't feel good to you? And can you be honest with yourself around that? So, there are a lot of people who are adults that continue to have unhealthy relationships with their parents because, we're a kin-oriented species. There's a lot of loyalty around that.
Mm,
Some people might, kind of have to have some hard conversations with themselves about limiting their contact with certain family members.
yeah.
If those relationships are not healthy, they may choose instead to gravitate towards friendships where people are consistently kind to them.
Right.
And because a lot of people are so isolated, sometimes we have to back up even further than that and say, if you don't have a lot of relationships in your life, where can you find them?
Right.
It could be something as simple as like picking up some volunteering in something that is a cause you're passionate about. Um, there's so much that we can do to bring ourselves into contact with people that are like-minded souls.
Hmm.
But I think that it is an area of our lives that really deserves our conscious consideration. What relationships feel good, which
Yeah.
ones don't, and how can I bring more relationships into my life where I feel good about who I am in the presence of this person.
I think it's so important. I'm so glad you brought it up. Energetically, you can call it energetically, you can call it intuitively, and you can call it what you just said, which is your nervous system will inform you.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think we have such power for our nervous system and ourselves to be tuned to, and like you said, listen to. our own system's ability to tell us what's good and what's bad and who's good and who's bad. And it's so
Yes.
interesting because I share this with my team all the time. I tell them, look, we're building this company to impact the world, but you don't understand the personal toll to turn me into a speaker who flies out and travels and we do trade shows. It is all like trauma to my nervous system because my nervous system is constantly calibrating. Are you good? Are you bad? Are you whole? Are you honest? Are you truthful? And it's interesting, someone new was hired into my husband's office, and I was there the other day, and this person really liked me and they hugged me. And my whole body had this reaction of like, no. And then recently, this person came up to me again and did it. And I don't know how to be rude and say no. And turns out they were stealing. I just learned that they were writing checks to themselves. And the day that was figured out was the day they hugged me. And I thought, wow, you're stealing from my husband, which actually means you're stealing from me. You have the audacity to hug me. And my nervous system told me since the first time I met you that you were a no. And I wasn't really listening. I knew it.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't like her, but why don't you like her? What is your problem? Why are you being judgy? That's
Mm-hmm.
not nice. And now I'm like, see, you intrinsically know. So
Mm-hmm.
I would love if that, I mean, there's many beautiful messages from this podcast episode today, but I think one of the biggest ones is listen to your own nervous system.
Yes, indeed.
Wow.
It's
Is
such a powerful example that you just offered everybody, such a powerful example. But it's you, I think that you are spot on. Our nervous systems will give us a lot of valuable information, but we have to check in and we have to listen.
right.
We have
And
to
to
open ourselves
listen,
up to that. Hmm.
you have to make space. To make
Hmm.
space, you can't be on your phone all day.
Exactly. There's got to at least be some moments and some pockets of time where you put the phone away and just be still with yourself. Tea time is me time. I love how you said that
Exactly.
before.
Exactly. It's my best way to force the breaks in the day because I
Mhm.
love tea. So I very consciously am like, tea time is me time. Get off your phone.
I
And
love it so much.
it creates that space. And one more thing that we spoke about is you're getting involved in the, or have been involved in the nonprofit world around environmentalism. And
Yeah.
there's this idea of a lot of us have this feeling of, oh my gosh, the environment. We're living on this planet, but we're poisoning this planet. And this like baseline anxiety that exists around like, how can we function in this world that's being poisoned? I know a lot
Hmm.
of us in the health and wellness space feel that way. Like, how do
Hmm.
we win
Hmm.
against this? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Couple quick ones that I think will be valuable. Yes, I think that this space that we're in right now that we're talking about is really important because it impacts all of us. You know, some people are more anxious about it than others. Some people are totally in denial, but whether you're in denial or not, it impacts all of us. And so the nonprofit that I sit on the board for it's called One Green Thing. It was founded by a woman named Heather White, who is fantastic. She's a real legend in the climate space. She's been an attorney, kind of climate attorney for over 25 years and had been counsel to Al Gore. And she's just a real, I have so much respect for her and really love her dearly. She's a good friend of mine. And there are a couple of things that Heather and I always talk about when we talk about this issue that are so important. One is that maybe the most important thing I could say to everybody is that it is not too late on climate. It actually sincerely is not actually too late.
Yeah,
We get the message a lot that it is too late,
sure.
but that messaging is contributing to a doomsday mentality that is sadly not inspiring anyone to take action. I don't want to say it's not inspiring anybody, but a lot of people are not inspired to take action because they feel like it's too late.
Yeah,
So, in this sort of sad, ironic way, it isn't too late. But the fact that we're so often doom scrolling and seeing, images of polar bears, floating out on
icebergs.
melting out, yeah, melting, like the icebergs that have
Yeah.
broken off. I mean, it's really all of this stuff is so terrible to watch.
Yeah.
So terrible for our nervous systems, so terrible for our collective nervous systems. And meanwhile, what the internet does to our brain around this issue, sadly, is contributing to people not taking action where they could.
Right.
So, what Heather and I talk about a lot when we talk about this is that, the human brain is wired to take positive action if we think that our positive action could lead to a positive outcome, right?
Right.
And so, in some ways, in order to take inspired action, we have to believe that it could lead us someplace good.
Right.
And so, what I want to encourage everyone who's listening to this to think about is, first of all, again, to bring it full circle to our iPhones and our internet behaviors,
Yeah.
doom scrolling is not doing our minds anything good. Goes back to that media diet that we were talking about before.
Yes.
And actually, there is so much room in the climate space for people to take positive action that actually could lead to the positive outcome that we all want.
Absolutely.
And if anything, going back to this idea of volunteering, if somebody is feeling like maybe they don't have the sense of community they really want, can they get out there and take a positive step towards rectifying the problem of climate change in a community-based way? So, for example, I live in Los Angeles. Sometimes people get together, they go out and they clean up the beaches. That's a really
Exactly.
pleasant group activity. You can meet other like-minded people doing something like that. And also, you get to take positive impact towards the benefit of the planet.
Absolutely.
So I just want to encourage people to think about it that way, that it's all of these things do go together in really complex, multifaceted ways. But I know that if Heather were here right now as the bona fide expert on this subject, what she would want everybody to know is that it isn't actually too late.
And what a beautiful, it's not that it's beautiful, what a profound thought. We believe that climate change is completely doomed, completely screwed. Like we're absolutely screwed. And thus we are. But if we just believed climate change is completely reversible and we have a part in it, and each one of us adds up to something. We don't believe this rhetoric around don't recycle, don't do anything. Everything you do is useless. And we instead just banded together and took small bits of action. We would win at the problem that we think is doomed. And I'm on the board of a beautiful nonprofit here in Boca called the Coastal Stewards. Their mission is to clean all coasts, and they're
Mm,
inspiring the youth to activate. And my children are in it. My daughter Anya is an environmentalist. Her organization's Pennies for Penguins. She's trying to save the penguins. And she's taught me so much about we can do it all. We can absolutely shift the climate and climate change issues. And it's so interesting because coming back full circle, like you said,
mm, mm.
we have a choice in what we consume. We have a choice to stand guard at the entrance of our mind. We have a choice to put that phone down at least half the time. Let's start with
Mhm,
50%, just
mhm.
50% of let's put that down and create that white space in our day. And thus, the shift in our mental health will be profound.
I think you just summed it up beautifully. And isn't it amazing how all those things go together? It's incredible, right?
Yeah, it really
Mhm.
is. So, do you have any parting words or parting thoughts for our audience? And then will you share where they can find you? Because I know with you, we could talk all day on this.
We absolutely could.
I'm so curious about like the mind and the abilities and how much can we leverage this beautiful mind we've been given to do great things in the world. So it's such a joy to talk to you.
Same here. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I will leave people with one last thought to kind of bring it all home, which is just to say that this idea, the idea that you just iterated and unpacked so well around what we believe is true for the sake of the planet, has a lot of really important corollaries for any one individual person's life, which is just to say that what we believe to be true for ourselves and our lives bears an incredible amount of weight when it comes to where we take action, who we become, the life we live, and that kind of stuff. And so I just want to encourage anybody, if they're listening, if they're feeling like they want to take action in their lives, and if they see something that they wish were different, I just want to encourage people to sort of believe in themselves and to really choose their own thoughts somewhat mindfully,
Yeah.
to take everything that we've said to heart and kind of put it into practice. All of this stuff would make a really big difference. And to let people know where to find me, my podcast is called The Nature of Nurture. It's in all the podcast apps. It's also on YouTube YouTube, I think, / at The Nature of Nurture. And my name is Leslie Carr, so people can find me at lesliecarr.com or at Dr. Leslie Carr on Instagram.
Awesome.
And would love to see people around.
Beautiful. And I feel like this topic of really investing deeply in our relationships is such a key part of it. We undervalue how the relationship is the key to all the happiness and all the joy.
Yes, our relationships in life, up to and including the relationship that we have with ourselves.
Absolutely.
Nothing is more important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Leslie. You're
Thank,
amazing.
thank you so much for having me. It's been a thrill ride.
Awesome. Well, everyone who came here to the Fusionary Health podcast, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Like, subscribe, leave a review. That's how we get more incredible guests and their messages out in the world to help influence and impact all of our health, our well-being, and our wellness overall. So thank you for joining us today. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Check out our sponsor, Fusionary Formulas, the potent turmeric supplement used by doctors around the U.S. for patients with pain and inflammation. www.fusionaryformulas.com. I'm your host, Dr. Shivani Gupta. For more, visit shivanigupta.com. Subscribe to this podcast in Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Click the follow button or subscribe in any of the apps that you use. That's all I've got for you on the Fusionary Health podcast this week. You have the power to transform your health and achieve vibrant health starting today.